Okay, everybody, welcome back to the Natural Awakening podcast with your host, me, Whiston. Today's guest is Stephen. I don't actually know how to pronounce your last name.
Zerfas.
Zerfas. Stephen Zerfas, founder and CEO, heading up the Jhourney company that currently is offering a lot of Jhāna retreats online, and you're doing some in person as well. Yeah,
That's right.
trying to scale and make these classic deep absorptive states of meditation coming out of the Buddhist tradition more accessible to a wider audience and general population that may not identify as religious Buddhists, where that has mostly happened in the past. So, Stephen, getting right into it, I thought we might start with a little bit of a bio. Who are you? What do you do? Aside from what I just said, maybe go into a little more detail. How'd you get into this? And what are you up to now?
Yeah, happy to. Oh, I'm excited to be talking with you, Whiston. So where to start? We Jhourney first, and then me. And so Jhourney, the company that you mentioned, is attempting to make a lot more accessible the jhanas, these altered states of meditation that can really span the spectrum from bliss to peace, and catalyze a host of additional personal development. And we think really personal transformation. The idea of taking these to more and more folks, we think, is something that's both incredibly electrifying, just something with tremendous potential to really bring a lot of well-being to a lot of people. In some ways, much the same way that other parts of the meditation world have been adapted to the Western context and brought to many more people already. This includes things like ranging from Vipassana to Advaita Vedanta and Hatha Yoga to Zen that is woven into something like mindfulness-based stress reduction. TM has sort of its secular version, and so we think in many ways there's an exciting opportunity to do this with the jhanas. And it's a similar and not totally novel playbook. I myself began meditating seriously about 5 years ago. I can happy to get into the personal story in a minute, and that's absolutely essential for how all of this began. Jhourney is co-led by myself and my dear friend and co-pilot Alex Gruver, and we've got a team of a few folks now. Judah Newman is our head of curriculum and has been playing an essential role in the retreats, and we have a few folks who have also recently joined us on board and have been just an absolutely essential part of the team. Would you like me to go into the personal story, and what would be like the most interesting parts of the bio from here?
Yes, I struggled a little with my mic there. I muted myself and the button was a little sticky.
Yeah.
So
sure.
If you could just jump a little more into the personal story. I remember you did already a fantastic interview with Michael Taft of the Deconstructing Yourself podcast, going into your bio. I would suggest to people, if they haven't already, go back, listen to that. But maybe, in brief, what was your way in? How did you discover these states for yourself, both independently and then, deepening them and exploring more with the teachers that you did?
Yeah, absolutely. So this whole story, I think, is just grounded in one big kind of hope and experiment of being able to share the thing that has been maybe more important to me than anything else in my life. And that's the just remarkable change in well-being, my sense of self, my understanding of my nervous system, that has been catalyzed, the sort of personal transformation that's been catalyzed by discovering the jhanas. And the sort of sequence that happened there is I was going through a really tough time. I was going through a difficult, just an absolute heart-wrenching breakup with a romantic partner, going through a breakup with a co-founder at the same time. And knowing very little about meditation, I went on a 10-day Goenka Vipassana as a Hail Mary, really, looking for anything that could help me through the tough time. I think I lost 2 jobs in one day. There was some other family. Basically, if it was going to hell, it could go to hell.
Sounds tough.
Yeah. even on retreat, it went to hell because I had 3 migraines in 8 days. And I remember thinking, for the first time in my life, I have to go seek professional mental help, and I can't keep doing this. And so I'm going to change the technique. And the short answer is I injected loving kindness into the body scan, which I actually found out years later is one of Sharon Salzberg's favorite meditations as well. And this made all the difference. And it took me in, it sort of resolved what stress headache that probably would have become migraine number 4. And it took me into this profoundly altered state where I was streaming tears of gratitude for 60 minutes, wide open, sense of spaciousness, a deep fundamental okayness, at least for that window where everything else seemed to be so hard. And I thought afterwards, so in Goenka style, they told me to ignore it. It's like, oh, we want neither craving nor aversion to these kinds of experiences. And I was like, I'm sorry, like I can't ignore that one. I need to know. Exactly. Maybe I'll come back and take the ignoring path later. But for now, I need to know what that was. And so I set out to run personal experiments to see if I could replicate. And I just sat on the edge of my bed and ran intentional experiments, an hour a day for about 4 months. Gradually taught myself how to recreate these states, doubled down to 2 to 3 hours a day, rotated the technique every 7 days, got to the point where I could replicate the state on command. And then there were multiple states on about 10 to 20 minutes notice. And now I'm like tearing up before work every morning. And mental health has done a complete 180. Even scores on personality tests changed. Like it was literally, it wasn't literally too good to be true because it was true, but it was,
Sure,
it was like this.
No,
it was this.
I relate. Sure.
Yeah. I could not believe this discovery that I had somehow won this lottery I didn't know existed. But maybe the hardest thing, and around this time too, I was using these states. I know some of this is a good repeat from the TAF podcast, but maybe the most exciting thing here wasn't the fact that I was tearing up with bliss every morning, but it was that I would drop into one of these clearly altered states, and then I would just go looking for the most painful thing I could come up with, and I would just let it wash over me. And from that place of like the bliss and peace in the background and this tremendous pain of a death of a loved one, or the traumatic breakup I mentioned, or some other like deeply personal, deep-rooted thing, eventually it would dissolve into like a background loving kindness or peace or ease. And then when I encountered the source of that negativity in the real world, it would be different. Stimuli, the automatic stimuli response, the subconscious, even before it kind of loomed into my experience to begin with, would be laced or would be just completely replaced with that peace and ease. And this was just stunning to me. It was like I was able to start to intentionally transform my own personality, methodically, but I think really targeting the things that I'd found so difficult in the past. And that was the thing. Bliss on demand sounds good, but being able to sort of intentionally, being able to intentionally change my subconscious, that was priceless. And so it was this sort of like just sort of like awestruck appreciation for this thing that was clearly happening to me, that I so wanted to share with family and friends, but found so difficult because I didn't have the language to. And I can't remember if I said this to Michael, but it's very easy for me to tell that story to somebody and they'd be like, "Steve, that sounds wonderful, but I don't have 10 months." Exactly. I don't have 10 months to find out that you're a freak. So, and I couldn't, and there was no response to that. I was thinking, hey, like, I don't know many other people who've had this experience. So I wouldn't want you to waste 10 months. And it wasn't until I read Lee Brasington's book a few years later, in which it clicked for me that it all came crashing down, right? It was, one, I wasn't alone. B, it was very possible to share this. C, the psychotech is already up and running and like out there and known. Like,
it's a well-trodden path with thousands of years of development behind it.
The excitement, like the sort of buzz, like the hairs in the back of my neck stood up at this idea that like, whoa, like this is all, it's like an amateur encountering a professional, and just that sort of deep sense of admiration and appreciation. And so that kicked off a period in which I did train with Lee Brasington, and then I sat at Twin Retreat and just loved that community. Delson Armstrong, Scott Jordan, Rachel O'Brien, Bhante Nanda made for a heck of a team. Later, I got to know Doug Craftwell, who's also in the Twin world. Along the way, Berbea had passed at this time, but you can't go more than a few sentences into practicing the jhanas without sort of falling in love with the man.
Oh, so, yeah, he's fantastic.
He is
those retreats, those recorded retreats are a goldmine.
Totally. And so that's where so much of the personal story begins to become professional, where it's like, hold up here. This thing that I so treasure, I'm not alone. It's possible to share. Why isn't it accessible to everybody? Why is it only sort of tucked away into this very esoteric pocket of the meditation universe that knows about these things and that has common language? What is it that we can do to find ways to take to scale? At first, that really looked like it was going to be a neurotech challenge because we were going to need, I looked at that problem and I was like, okay, well, the main thing, and I know this is also to be had elsewhere, but I think all the listeners here, this will set the context, is like, if you ask yourself, why isn't this thing that sounds almost too good to be true already at scale? That's just, and you're thinking about, quitting your job and throwing your life savings into this kind of thing, and it could all be for naught. Like, it's a scary question, because like, surely there's a good reason. Surely there's like a reason why it's like impossible to scale, or why like smart people have failed in the past. And so I was really grappling with this question, and the best I could do, after really trying to sort of falsify my best idea, right? There's this like, love this idea, like, if you haven't falsified your best idea in a year, you probably haven't tried. And
Sure,
it's like, okay, here's my best idea. Can I knock this sucker down? If I can't, then I can sort of tentatively, cautiously sort of go climb on top of it and start continuing building the tower of like how I'm going to live my life, or sort of like start a company, these kinds of things. And the best I can come up with is like, the problem here is there's something fundamentally different about meditation relative to other skills, and that it's hard to verify. And so unlike everything from swimming to astrophysics, it's just clear, immediate, confident feedback loops, and that determines a confident, fast rate of learning. But with meditation, all the feedback loops get gunked up with guesswork. Even if you have the world's best teacher, if you're describing what's going on in your head, not only is it invisible, they can't see it, but it's also literally pre-verbal. This is a scary problem if you're going to sort of take the leap and dedicate years of your life, perhaps burn half of your life savings, or who knows what it's going to take in order to try to get some dream off the ground. In order to be able to do so confidently, like, you have to have an answer for why hasn't it been scaled before. And that's what brings us to this notion that meditation is hard to verify, that there's the feedback loops can get really gunked up. So we first set out to tackle this problem with the question of like, okay, well, what's different now? Now we have modern tools that might be able to crack this feedback problem open in a new way. And so we were like, okay, this has been around for a long time, for millennia, actually, not just like, a few decades or something.
Pre-Buddhist, even pre-Buddha, that people were rocking the jhanas as long as we've had nervous systems, is my bet.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. and not only that, but it cuts across like time. I think I'm quite convinced that it cuts across not just time, but also space. The phenomenological reports of Christian mystics, of Mormons,
Teresa of Avila, Saint John of the Cross, Sufi mystics, absolutely.
Sufi mystics, exactly. And so it seems quite likely the case that these states have just been rediscovered over and over again by different sort of cultures and traditions over time. And yet here we are in 2024. Back then, I guess it was 2023, 2022, depending on when you count. And they're not just like everyday thing. And in fact, there's all these like paradigm breaking things that flow from once you sort of learn how to do the jhanas and sort of know that the jhanas are real. This notion that you have to have external stimuli in order to find bliss or peace or fulfillment has to go out the window.
It's manifestly not true.
It's just wrong. And it's like this thing that sort of basically
obviously
has been a crazy background assumption driving so much of my behavior. The kinds of like triple backflips with a twist that try to stick the landing in order to get a little bit of a pleasure hit that I would do prior to is just insane. And so
I must have this gallon of ice cream. I must.
Yeah. It really begins to call into question relationships to all kinds of different, I think, craving and aversion, to sort of pleasure and pain. It really also, I think, calls to question the idea of thinking of well-being and as like largely a deficit-based paradigm, one in which we're going to take ourselves back to some sort of normal status quo, instead of thinking like, wait a second, there is I can fundamentally like reach new highs, and I can use the more importantly not just like high in a temporary sense, but I can use these altered states to alter my traits. Now, so it's like I can sort of creep baseline well-being up over time. Like all of these things flow from something as radical as the jhanas, and so this is a shocking thing. It's like, okay, I want to scale it, but they've been rediscovered time and time again. Why are they not already at scale? Why does not everybody have access to them? And this is where it seems like, okay, I have no other answer then the fact that there's this unique thing about meditation relative to other things. It's this guesswork problem. So let's use the answer to the why now question. What's different this time around as opposed to 20 years ago, as opposed to 1,500 years ago? And that is, we're going to use modern tools to see if we can cut the guesswork out of the equation, and using biosensors and neurofeedback or biofeedback. And so that's where we started, and went out to collect a robust data set and begin to make progress against that challenge. And as part of that R&D process, we also needed to start running retreats, because how else were we going to get data? And we ran a few retreats without the tech, because it was just too much to try to learn how to do retreats and do tech at the same time. And we were delighted that the experimentation mindset, even before the tech arrived on the scene, yielded sort of delightful results. It was 2/3 or more of novices were getting into these states in under a week, and they were saying things about them that we were hoping they would.
I'm gonna jump in here.
Yes,
so
please.
That knowing some Jhāna teachers across the spectrum of depth of concentration, shall we say, Lee Brasington, Stephen Snyder. I haven't hung out with the twin folks like you have, but there's a spectrum of depth. I mean, you addressed this a little on Michael's podcast. So when you say 2/3 of people are entering Jhāna, where on that spectrum would you place them? Are you talking the relatively lighter depth of absorption that you might find in, say, a Tranquil Wisdom Insight meditation, that circle? Are you talking about Lee Brasington? I'm assuming you're not getting people full non-dual, hours absorption like you'd find in one of Pa'ak Sayadaw's forest monasteries.
Yeah, I think that's a safe assumption too. I've never been to one of Pa'ak's monasteries, but I think that's a pretty safe assumption.
Me neither, but I know people who have, and it's I've had a little bit of experience of those states, and they are radically different from the others. So
yeah. So the thing that we were interested in really wasn't actually the definition of Jhāna, and wasn't actually even to some extent the degree of absorption. We were just interested in impact. We're like, is this really making a difference in folks' life? And if they are talking about their experiences that phenomenologically match, they're talking about it being a bit more of like seeming as if its source may be from the head for that first Jhāna, maybe a bit more in the heart for the second Jhāna.
Right. So this is more on the TWIM side of things, where if you're talking to someone like Lee, eventually you want to move to full body pervasion. So you're not seeing as much of that in the retreats. Is that accurate to say?
No, actually. So we do see that. So it will be like a full body pervasion. But even when you're in that full body pervasion, if you sort of ask somebody like, does it seem as if there's a locus or a source? And they're like, yeah, it is full body, but so it doesn't really make sense. But I would probably say the stomach. I'd probably say the head. And then there's these other sort of factors, which is like deep amount of contentment is like a very different experience than just like an overwhelming amount of love where I'm starting to tear up, or which is also a different experience from sort of like a rapture, glee, euphoria thing that's like kind of feeling like it's coming up through the body and lifting me up. And so these sorts of things are very typical of the like categories, so to speak, like categorical differences between Jhāna 1, 2, 3, and 4. There is this gradient of how absorbed they are, the extent to which other sort of sounds and stuff and other stimuli are present in their experience, the extent to which thoughts are present. And the thing that we were so interested in, I feel like we saw like for sure some folks going into, it's all relative here, but what we would call like relatively deep absorption states. I think clearly like Lee Brasington-esque Jhānas. I certainly don't think. I think you're right. I'm not sure we've had anybody that reported I didn't have a thought for 3 hours.
Sure.
Although when you get into those late TWIM, even the TWIM Jhānas, if you're hanging out in J7 and you do it for 2 hours, like you may only have a thought or two. So it is interesting to sort of think about the nuanced differences between these different classifications. But the point that I want to drive home is, for us, the thing that we were most interested in is the extent to which this was extraordinary for folks. And when someone's saying like, this was my best meditation, this was my best experience of meditation in 50 years, or this was my like, I cannot believe this is real. Like this is what? This is just not like easily the most blissful thing that's happened to me in over a year or more. Or like, this reminds me of my wedding day. Like these are all anecdotes that we've heard on retreat. And at this point, we've now heard, over 100 of these kinds of things. And so it was this that we were like, okay, hang on here. Like this matters. This could be so valuable. And, the specific definitions of whether or not like sounds are registered in a certain way seemed a lot less interesting to us.
Than psychological impact and participants' rating of their well-being increasing as a result of their participation. That's more what we're homing in on.
Exactly. Yeah. So in some, we basically look for two things. It's like, okay, does it sort of categorically match descriptions of Jhāna 1, 2, 3, 4 based off of like the emotional, sensational aspects of it? And do people sort of refer to it as like something like the best thing that's happened in 6 months or more to them? Like this gives some sort of indication that this is like serious magnitude. And, we have had people who've been like, I was in a Jhāna, and I asked them, I was like, yeah, it was probably the best thing that's happened to me this week. And I'm like, I don't think we're going to count that for I'm thrilled for you.
You have an amazing weekly baseline, or
yeah, exactly. So that's exactly my next question. Is I talk to them about their usual weeks, but for the most part, that wasn't the kind of thing that we were interested in.
Yeah, sure. Well, I think you've done a really good job kind of laying the groundwork, giving your personal story, and then talking about how well it's going. As you know, though some of the listeners may not, I posted it up on Twitter that we were going to be having this interview, and I received some questions, some of them a little challenging, from some established teachers within the Buddhist and secular pragmatic Dharma scene. So let's talk about how this can go wrong, because it can, and what your protocols and precautions are in place and support that you may be able to offer some people. So first off, I guess let's start with question number one. Have you, in your retreats, had people having significant adverse experiences during the retreat or in follow-ups?
Yeah. So adverse effects are a super important question. They appear exceedingly rare, but they're a super important question, and one that I think it's even more important as you think about working with more folks. Because
as you scale it, that even if it's only a tiny percentage,
exactly,
that becomes in absolute terms quite a lot of people.
Exactly. You absolutely, as you think about scale, need to think about edge effects and or edge cases, and it would be heartbreaking to have someone have like a truly adverse experience. And in some ways, like large numbers require us large numbers absolutely require us to be prepared for that kind of thing. So we think about this in a few ways. The first is if we think about the potential for adverse effects, we really need to understand the problem. We need to understand the nature of the problem, the scope, the size of it. And I think here, much more importantly than anecdotes, are base rates. We need to know, are we talking 1% of the population or 10% or 50% when they end up doing high dose meditation in this kind of dose? And unfortunately, even though a lot of, thousands of people have gone through this kind of high dose meditation, particularly in this style before, research is really new and limited. And the sort of knowledge that each teacher accrues over time is anecdotal, usually not carefully tracked. And so it becomes tricky to really understand what's the size of the issue that we're looking here. We also know that some of the research that does exist is so important to be investigating what are the adverse effects of meditation and things like basic mindfulness and high doses of these things writ large. It's also, in my mind, it's really important that we parse techniques. Because in the same way we wouldn't expect swimmers and football players to have the same concussion rates, we wouldn't expect like loving kindness or high-speed noting to have the same kinds of adverse effects.
Sure.
Yeah. So already you can imagine, all right, this is getting a little tricky to figure out what kind of problem we're really dealing with here. Fortunately, we can do our best to triangulate against the sort of the scientific data, the sort of tribal knowledge built up in the minds of expert teachers over time by interviewing them about their base rates and what they've seen. And then also, as we gradually scale, we can look at our own data to see what kinds of numbers we're seeing. And we can use all that to get a better and better sense over time as to what is the nature of this problem that we're up against. The second part of this, so one is like figuring out the nature of the problem. The second is, okay, what is the right way to intervene here? And this is another spot where I think it's not clear what the obvious best practices are. There's sort of different teachers will tell you different things. For a lot of teachers, because they honestly haven't seen a lot of negative side effects, they haven't really thought about this problem. And that is perfectly rational because it's just not come up yet in their experience. Even if we think we know it's only a matter of time for us because of the kinds of numbers that we hope to work with. So our plan really involves a few parts. And this is after we've talked to 5 experts explicitly about the plan and then interviewed a number of other teachers about what they've seen. And it's sort of pre-retreat, particularly filtering and screening criteria, particularly as it may exacerbate or play with existing mental health conditions.
And for that, are you thinking of things like people predisposed to psychosis or already struggling with some kind of schizophrenic, that spectrum of yeah.
Exactly. So actually, the best source of analogous inspiration that we could find to tackle this otherwise really, we think, difficult problem is psychedelic research exclusion criteria. And
Right.
so
Yep.
we worked closely with an Oxford-trained psychiatrist who was involved in the writing of some of these exclusion criteria and adopted. It took a lot of inspiration from Imperial College London's psychedelic research exclusion criteria, and are now using that to screen folks who fill out a mental health questionnaire, and then depending on sort of how they answer that questionnaire, we will either say, hey, we're really sorry, but out of abundance of caution and the importance of keeping everybody safe, we don't yet have the confidence that we can support you on this retreat. Or if it's sort of like a softer, like a yellow flag, we'll get on the phone and we'll say, hey, we think that there's some cause to be concerned about how your particular causes and conditions are going to interact with the really high dose loving kindness meditation that we're doing on this retreat. And let's talk about how that might unfold and put together a specific plan that has a few pieces in place. And then we sort of have it down. And then should we need to use it on retreat, we can instantly reference it. Then on retreat, so that's kind of the screening process, which is pre-retreat. During retreat, we have a monitoring process. This is
are you doing interviews in a classical Jhāna style retreat? You'd be meeting with the teacher every day or every other day, depending on what the teacher has capacity for. Like how frequent are those check-ins?
That's right. So we have been doing interviews every day so far. We're constantly sort of experimenting with new ways in which we think we can get improve success rates, and also allow us to do so with a certain number of facilitators and this kind of thing. And so we're going to be experimenting with different interview rates over time. But in addition to the interviews, we are also regularly collecting surveys and feedback from folks. And that allows us to take note of wow, this person had a really tough day yesterday, or diet or sleep, diet or sleep or something along these lines changed. And this allows us to sort of keep tabs on folks, and then we can also match it against criteria that we hope to continue to sharpen with experts over time. Should we need to jump in and be like, hey, we think it's really smart that you instantly cut back dosage, that you follow the plan that we made in advance, that you, and if necessary, that you seek medical support, because we don't provide medical support on our retreats, but we can, almost like an ambulance.
Imagine the worst case scenario. Game. Say someone comes in, they they meet all the screening criteria, and they spin themselves up into a kind of manic psychosis. What happens then? Because these kinds of things do happen. I imagine with the numbers you're working with, it's only a matter of time until something like that will happen.
Certainly, yeah. So if that happens, then we immediately jump into what we sort of laid out in the plan. It'll be contacting their people who we listed for support. It'll be getting in touch with an organization that professionally deals with this kind of response. It may involve calling 911, depending on what the issue is. And we'll have a list of folks that we can refer out or pull in if necessary to that have both experience in deep meditation and Western, psychology. And we think that that's valuable because, as our mutual friend Daniel Ingram has really invested in the last decade or so, having folks who have been deeply in both worlds can be an important part about navigating the Western medical system, because some of the meditation experiences and perhaps adverse effects too aren't yet on the radar of the DSM, for example.
Yeah, well, I'm glad to hear that you have thought about this. You have protocols in place. You have screening and exclusion criteria, and then you do have concrete plans. Because I've heard as a teacher and also as just someone in the scene, a lot of horror stories of well-meaning, well-intentioned teachers or retreat centers or whatever, and someone ends up going off the deep end. And the teachers or the center are totally not prepared to deal with that kind of thing. They don't have protocols in place. And then they either tell the person to leave the retreat, or they stay in the retreat and just get worse. Then there's no follow-up afterwards. And in the worst cases, that person will then do serious harm to themselves or someone else. That's rare. That's really rare, but it does happen. So I'm glad that you have protocols and you've considered this.
Yeah.
So a lot of teachers and retreat centers don't or haven't. And there's horror stories.
Absolutely. I think it's a moral imperative to be sharp about this thing. The other thing that I think I should say, I mentioned three parts, which is the screening, monitoring, and the off ramping. There's a fourth part that might be the most important piece of all, which is prevention. And there's a lot of ways you can move to prevent here. One of the biggest ones is actually baked into the instructions ourselves. They're baked into the instructions themselves, and it's part of the reason why we conduct a retreat the way we do, leading into a loving kindness approach to the jhanas is something that in sort of deeper meditation circles amongst teachers seem to be almost a consensus as the
it's my
absolutely
preferred
softest
and it's what I
safety
give to students who are interested in jhanas. Yeah.
I think it's my preferred way. It's my preferred on ramp for effectiveness, for accessibility, and also for safety. It's really got the trifecta. It's the gentlest on ramp. In some ways, in some sort of kind of circles of tribal knowledge, it's prescribed as the antidote to certain adverse effects. It's and in fact, of the probably dozen or teachers that we've talked to informally and formally about this, only one had even heard of adverse effects pertaining to loving kindness, and those were when it exacerbated prior history of abuse trauma. And
that makes sense. Sure.
I thought that it makes a lot of sense. And but that I think speaks to the sort of actually somewhat intuitive aspect of the technique here, where if you really are leaning into things like compassion, gratitude, kindness, that can be a huge part of in creating that sort of emotional backdrop. Then when you encounter some of the whoa, I'm not who I thought I was sort of moments, it can be the equanimity has been cultivated and prepared in the system, as opposed to going, Shinzen likes to talk about sensory clarity, equanimity, and concentration being like the three pillars of any wisdom tradition. And if you, and so you might think about your personal progress as going along any of those three dimensions. And if you've underdeveloped the equanimity and you're playing fairly advanced ball in the other two, you're getting rocky territory. And this is in some ways,
it's not so much fun.
Yeah, I remember you telling me that you've had some, and so, but if you take that kind of mental model, I think it can illustrate how valuable prevention may be here by saying, okay, well, let's do the equanimity first, and proceed in that way. And so I think this is just a really important part of the overall plan too.
Wonderful. I think you've pretty well addressed all
actually, you know what? I do have
safety. Oh, okay.
There's one other thing that I want to add, which I think is this cuts across accessibility, effectiveness, and safety as well, which is that running somebody else's algorithm in your own head is a high-risk business. If you're doing so, I should clarify. If you're running somebody else's algorithm on infinite loop in your own head, I think is high-risk business. And so one of the things that we really lean into is this notion of agency and experimentation. Number one, and then number two, following gradients of curiosity, relaxation, and perhaps also sort of those like equanimity, like pro-social gradients. And so this, we really attempt to establish right out of the gate, look, because we're in invisible and pre-verbal territory, we can't have a guru-student model here. We can only have a lead engineer and panel of advisors model here, and you're the lead engineer. Like it has to be that way. And so please do not give up your agency or give up, your infinite loop controls and just bang out like whatever, because almost certainly you'll get some sort of understanding of the technique wrong. It's pre-verbal. How could I give you a verbal technique and you get it perfectly right? And so for you to run it on infinite loop and soldier on in some sort of way means you're going to be making some assumptions, no doubt. And the only way that you can correct that is if you have the agency and the experimentation mindset to do so. And this also becomes a really important piece of the prevention puzzle.
Wonderful. And you spoke to it a little bit, but what kind of follow-up do you do with people afterwards? Are you taking data from people a week, a month, several months? Do people retain access to these states after retreat? And do you have any monitoring or just like, are you available to provide help if people do run into adverse effects a week on, a month on?
Yeah, totally. So I love this question because it only comes from the folks who are already deep in the territory. and they know how valuable that the personal transformation is, as opposed to the peak experience, and that it's really in that like ongoing applied.
Because you can go on retreat and hang out in bliss for the whole retreat, and then come out and you can speak to it.
Totally. But and unless in that on that retreat, some sort of like fundamental shift happens, like you sort of enter into, I quite like this the Martin phrase, fundamental okayness. This then absent those kinds of like persistent, lasting effects, which like many psychedelic therapy experiences, like can't happen from a trip all the time. There's so much the translation from holy shit to life change comes from the sort of ongoing applied practice and discovering like you have new agency to be the person you aspire to be by dropping into one of these states, using the afterglow to navigate a reconciliation conversation with your partner, or embrace a board meeting from a new place, or engage in memory reconsolidation, the sort of like some of the stuff we were talking earlier about overcoming like death of a loved one, this kind of thing. So and the list goes on. But it's after the retreat where that ongoing application, I think, can get really rich. We are ramping that up, the follow-up with folks, and I think thinking about, is there some sort of like active coaching support? Is there some sort of active community support that will really bring the retreat integration to life? So far, our efforts have really been about optimizing the retreat, but that's an exciting part of our roadmap.
So I think we've covered pretty well the adverse effects, both in the retreat, what you can hope to follow up with people after that with, and you're developing and rolling that out. It's still experimental. And I should probably say the degree of support you're already giving and intend to continue to develop is more than a lot of Jhāna teachers can provide now, being single teachers. So as an organization, you actually have that advantage, which is nice. So one of the other more challenging questions that came in from the folks over on Twitter is, so the jhanas as conceived, as you learned them from teachers who are a little more traditionally religious and Buddhist, is there an element here where, to put it bluntly, some people would look at what you're doing and say, hey, here you are, a secular guy setting up a company, extracting a style of meditation from an existing religious tradition and making a company around it and making it into a product to sell on the market. And for some people, that sets off a lot of alarm bells. I guess I'll just leave it there. What would your response be to someone who brings those concerns?
Yeah. It's a really interesting set of concerns, and I think my biggest instinct is to get really specific on what's the root of the concern. Sort of where is the fear? So there are some things that we know to be true that are certainly desirable. Like we know innovation, we know imagination, we know combination of new ideas is just so like part and parcel, not just to like progress and helping to people, but also the human experience. If that weren't the case, then like art and engineering and childhood play would be something that we would want to be fearful of. And so it can't be all of that in some way. This idea of being really mindful about taking something from another culture, I think is there's a kernel to it that I like sort of want to hold up as like, that makes a ton of sense to me, and I really want to like appreciate and acknowledge your concern there. And that would be if in doing so we were doing something that was actively harming people. But the idea of combining things and finding new ways to bring these to more folks is really about helping folks, and doing so from like a deeply human place. It's about like increasing the accessibility and the awareness of things like gratitude, kindness meditation, things that cascade into so many other aspects of life. And that seems really, really valuable, and can only be done if we come together and put our heads together and our experiences together. So that's number one. I think a couple other things that sort of come to mind are the history of sort of learning to help people and with progress comes from combining all kinds of different things together. And like Buddhism itself has moved through so many different chapters and different cultures, and that's been beautiful.
If you look, it's incredible, the diversity. I mean, I've trained in Theravada, Zen, Vajrayana, Dzogchen. My goodness,
Amazing.
what a diverse tapestry.
And
that has
tapestry,
changed over the centuries and geographically.
Totally,
immensely.
totally. And that tapestry, I think, makes it all the more valuable. And so there's a line that I heard somewhere that I really appreciated, which is like, at one point in time, singing bowls were cutting edge technology. And today we have things like biosensors and experimentation methods and modern pedagogy. And like, we hope to contribute to that tapestry in that way. And so I think, and then the third thing I'd say is that it's also important to get specific about, like, okay, what is the bar that we are really looking for with regards to concerns about pulling from one culture to another. You know, we had, I think it was 7 teachers. I'd have to go back and do the count, like, come and sit in on our early retreats and give feedback. Some of them from some of the lineages we were talking about earlier, the Twim tradition or the Lee Brazen Tenaya Kema. Lee himself came and gave feedback on the retreat. And so and then our teaching team has personally sat with many of these folks and just so treasured their advice and their experience. And now we get to refer students back to them and you know, they come and sit with us and they've got some specific questions, or they're looking to get more into the metaphysics. And we're like, hey, we've got some people for you, and can send them that way. And so I see it so much as like the whole thing is like, well, like a symphony or some sort of like delightful combination of many different things together, a tapestry.
Modern fusion cuisine of Dharma techniques.
I love that.
And I imagine there are, like, if you spoke to a very conservative Orthodox Theravadan, they probably wouldn't recognize what you're teaching as Jhāna, and they might be upset. And there might not be any budging on that. I mean, again, you might be able to have a conversation with them and pick apart, as you're saying. What exactly are your concerns?
Yeah,
for the most part,
I'd certainly love to learn from them.
For the most part, my traditional religious teachers, ensconced, monastics and lay teachers within lineages, as long as there's like maintenance of good relations between whoever is attempting to popularize, secularize, etc., maintenance of good relations, and a referring back, like accrediting of one's sources, like a good academic, or then I haven't run into anyone personally who's categorically opposed. I think from my perspective, which is just my perspective, you're doing it in a respectful and responsible way. So there's that.
We certainly aspire to. Yeah, and I think it would be the stakes are high. Suffering sucks, and I would hate to sort of take a lens that inadvertently drew us more divided than coming together to sort of create some of this stuff, and would want to learn from everybody.
Personally, I think the world would be a much better place if everyone could blast through the first 4 jhanas every morning before they went about their day-to-day life. I believe you and the teachers I know who maybe have some of these concerns, I'm sure they're actually on the same page with that. It's just a matter of method, means of arrival. Yeah,
probably so. Yeah, you don't have to sell me on that vision. Yeah.
We've run through most of the questions and comments and concerns that I got through Twitter. We talked a little bit about what we were going to talk about before we actually started recording. Is there anything that we haven't run through that I have missed? If I'm searching through, so let just go ahead.
Yeah. So I think I did see a question on Twitter about the status of the tech, and also I think something about what seems to be working, and then one on like how accessible may we see these things to the general population. And I'm happy to talk to you.
And then also there's another point. Maybe let's take this one first. In a traditional like Buddhist context, you would take these absorbed states of concentration and then apply them to an insight practice. And there's tons and tons of insight practices, hundreds, and whatever you choose to do, whichever one of those. Doing it from a place, emerging from a state of absorbed concentration, you're going to be much more effective at that. On retreat or off of retreat, do you direct people towards those kinds of techniques, which classically will result in really more radical phenomenological transformations regarding perception of self, perception of other. You see where I'm going.
Yeah, totally. So We know of sort of a different. We've seen a few schools of thought on how to think about the jhanas as it pertains to what's classically called insight practice. So like investigating the nature of reality, exploring sort of who you are, this kind of thing. And those schools of thought largely seem to be you do the jhanas to prepare yourself to then be able to do this effectively. And the other school of thought is like actually the jhanas themselves can be seen as an insight practice.
Definitely.
And a part of that is sort of the view you take, and also sort of how you engage with them. Since we're so focused on the jhanas, but doing so for what we think is like really about come for the bliss, stay for the personal transformation, we have kind of carved our way through this territory with a couple ideas. The first is that let's get folks as deep into the jhanas as possible on a single retreat. So there's actually a couple other things that we've considered, and so one of them is, and sometimes we still advocate, we suggest that folks on our retreat do these. One of them is we have them actively engage in memory reconsolidation work, which is sort of like kind of looking at like difficult memories and doing so from a place of the jhana and seeing if you can use that almost like the way a psychedelic can enhance the size effect of
MDMA trauma therapy is what comes
exactly this
in my
kind
mind.
of thing. Yeah. So, and then the third thing that we sort of have folks do. So like one is like, okay, push your edge of practice as far into the jhanas as possible. Two is begin to use this for something like memory reconsolidation. And the third is, although we don't really like advocate that for everybody, and we want to like talk to them about whether that's a good idea given their particular circumstances, this kind of thing. But then the third thing is what we call like jhana boot camping, and learning to like drop into a jhana directly without going to the prior jhanas, or like kind of running them like musical scales.
Really
sort of
mastering that you would
exactly.
you see described in classical texts. Play them up and down like scales, jump between them
Bingo.
in and out of order. 4 to 1, 1 to 4.
Exactly. Totally. And I think the musical scale analogy is wonderful because as you learn these first as discrete states and sort of play them kind of rigidly, then you begin to play them like kind of artfully and fluidly, and then you get them faster. And so it doesn't take as much cognitive overload to use that to sort of like back into one. And so then you can use that for your day-to-day life in a new way. Like all these things follow. And what we found was we were originally thinking, okay, once somebody's a certain way into the jhanas, we can begin telling them, hey, you have 3 options here. And this is sort of like intuitive from the teaching team. We sort of began to find that they all kind of collapse nicely on helping people further the edge of their practice. Because if you get into a deeper jhana or later jhana, maybe you have access to the first 4 and you learn to get access to the first 6. It seems to also affect your ability to easily get access into the first few, sort of the way jhana jumping would have. And
sure.
Part of the sort of thesis here is that these later states are often they're subtler, they're quieter. You're like operating with learning to spot and dance with mental tension at levels you've never before sort of played the game at. And so if you can play at the subtler level, then playing at the coarser level is easier. And so these two things kind of go together nicely. The second is that if you spend a decent amount of time in these states, some stuff tends to bubble up. And it becomes quite intuitive to go at your own pace for using that state to tackle that thing that your boss said at work the other day that's really been bothering you. And so some of that seems to also come along too. And so that seems like a pretty good goal then for us if we're working mostly with novices or folks who haven't been to the jhanas before on their first retreat to take them as far as possible. That being said, we it's really top of mind for us to think about like, okay, how do we make these jhanas really life-changing for folks? And that can involve from like integration and application to day-to-day life. That could take inspiration from classical insight stuff where you like drop into a jhana and then you do the 5 recollections or some of these other techniques. And we think that's great too. We also think that the way we teach the jhanas, which is very spacious, wide open, wide aware, all the way through, is a lot closer to certain understandings of emptiness and later Buddhist ideas. And so particularly on the teaching team, we occasionally have internal conversations and even bring those ideas up specifically with folks depending on where they're at. And all of these things I think are going to be rich ideas by which to explore as the organization matures and we're able to continue to build out like the full suite of retreat and retreat experiences.
Exciting. I mean, it's I'm glad to hear that this is all very much a work in progress, and you're continually taking feedback, and you're it's a moving target here, and you're attempting, you're workshopping it all the time and refining. So that's great to hear.
Yeah, the experiment hasn't stopped. It's just one big experiment to see how we can like learn from each other to sort of make these states accessible and all the downstream benefits.
So let's speak about making them more accessible. Like what's best case scenario here in terms of scaling? How accessible do you imagine we can make this with, I mean, there's retreat formats. You could just be like doing lots and lots of retreats, have a massive organization, make it as accessible to as many people as possible at the lowest cost. I assume that is of interest to you.
Totally.
And then there's also the tech angle, which is a little less developed, as I understand it.
Yeah, totally. So when we set out, we were operating from the assumption that the missing piece of the puzzle was only tech, or at least I would say it this way. We knew that the full vision of the product is something like you imagine you put on a headset of some kind, you open up an app, you get world-class Jhāna instructions. As you begin following instructions, the instructions or the music you're listening to changes in real time based on the biosensors. This vision has two pillars to it. One is the real-time accurate feedback, which cuts out the guesswork. The other is world-class instruction. And so it's both a qualitative and a quantitative puzzle. And we set out thinking that if we made a certain amount of progress on the quantitative side, it would...
My cat has decided to make an appearance.
Oh, hello, Wiston's cat. Yeah.
Carry on. Ignore the cat.
We set out thinking that if we made a certain amount of progress on the quantitative side, namely having some sort of, even if it wasn't closed loop back to the user, but towards the teacher, they're getting close to Jhāna. Now we would begin to iterate in a whole new game. It would be completely game changing for our ability to experiment on the qualitative side. That was the initial thesis. And then we were surprised to discover that we could actually make a lot of progress on the qualitative side, with even without the quantitative side having made a lot of progress. This is super exciting because what it means is you can build a pipeline that allows for the kinds of data collection that historically has prevented the development of this kind of quantitative tech. Right. And that is like just absolutely riveting. Like it's electrifying to me. And so this now puts you in a spot where you not just have like one shot on goal. It's like, okay, we're going to take a calculated bet here that EEG with a certain amount of data, we're going to get the machine learning algorithms working, and then we're going to turn around and we're going to build some very, very crude minimum viable product that allows folks to get into these states faster. That's like one big shot that's we're really looking towards this sort of deep tech play. If you've got an existing Jhāna pipeline and you can teach folks in this, now you can ask all kinds of questions that are going to make you iteratively better over time. So you're going to get way more shots on goal, and each one is going to be higher probability of success. And this blows open the aperture from understanding developmental trajectories to thinking about practice matching based off things like, qualitative, personality traits or something. Perhaps that helps us identify.
In classical text, they have personality typologies with recommended practices based on that.
Totally.
Who knows how well those will hold up compared to like modern psychometric measures?
Sure.
But that kind of
the idea is not new.
Yeah, collective knowledge base and that kind of effort is not new. You just have big data sets and refined mathematical modeling capabilities now.
Totally. So by putting the qualitative before the quantitative, you suddenly, I think, your probability of success somewhere and in some way, shape, or form blows open. And that, I think, is really exciting and something that we've just been leaning into more and more as these retreats, I think, have been continue to be successful. You can so now you imagine a world in which you're like, okay, let's use instead of trying to go straight from hundreds of hours or thousands of hours of trying to of practice to try to learn these states and get it down to something like 10 hours using the tech. Let's now that we've got it down to 25 to 40 hours and it's something that we can continuously learn and iterate on, let's put not just 10 or 100 people in these states, but 1,000 or 10,000 people in these states. And that's going to teach us so much about the process to do so. Yep. And it's going to give us a lot of access to data. And so your timeline to when you have the helmet, the Jhāna helmet, is
you're looking at something like neurofeedback for that, right? You're not looking at direct stimulation inducing these states.
Although, because you have the Jhāna pipeline, something like neural stimulation is now suddenly way less costly because you can just try it. and like see if it works. And you have the resources and the ability to iterate on it. And so all of this stuff is in the mix. And if you make it some way down EEG, but then you get, the FNIRS technology catches up or something like this, you can try that too. And it's not going to kill you if one of these things doesn't work out. And so you're so much more robust to these kinds of things. And that I think is really exciting. And it means that the timeline to the Jhāna helmet, your first attempt at the Jhāna helmet is farther into the future, but your odds of success are so much higher.
So much higher. That makes a lot of sense.
And maybe even more exciting for us, you're helping people along the way. Like, when we ran our first, I guess it was actually the second retreat in which I was like collecting the video clips and putting it together and replaying what folks had said. I just closed my laptop and cried for 30 minutes. It was like, it still kind of gives me a little goosebumps thinking about it. Like, there's only so many dreams that truly come true in your lifetime. And like when I quit my job to try to make these, to share these with folks, like I was like, okay, this is crazy. I'm like, people would probably call me certifiably insane. I want to do this thing. I want to use tech in a way that hasn't been used. Many people have. They probably still do. and we should talk about that. I did all this, like, leaving my job and sort of running against the grain in some ways on this crazy dream. And in my mind, I had a clear litmus test for whether or not it would be worth it. Like, taking a few years off, maybe dead weight loss for your career, spending a bunch of life savings, whatever. And that litmus test was like, if I could share it with one person, it'd all be worth it. Like, and this stuff is
now it's hundreds, right? In the hundreds, or
we've had a few hundred people on retreat now. And so the moment in which that was happening, and we discovered that we could do this as we continue to work towards the vision of not 10,000 folks in these states, but 10 million. That was something we couldn't pass up. And to your question earlier, it's sort of like, okay, what's the future of the company, the future of the organization? I think that is the difference between 10,000 and 10 million folks. Is you got to get something working. I think it's tech that enhances the retreats or enhances the experience so that folks can learn to do this on their own. And so we're excited to continue work towards that vision. And we're going to do so learning at every step of the way.
Well, that's good to hear. I mean, as someone who has benefited a lot from Jhāna practice, encountering it first on my own, reading from texts, I didn't do it quite as de novo as you managed to, but reading from text, not really having a retreat that was dedicated to it, or a teacher who could kind of help me through it, and gaining just a little bit of mastery that way, just working off of books and recordings and whatnot. And then, later on, if I talk about my practice, Jhāna's a part of it. It's been important for me in my path. And then people are like, oh, where can I go and learn it? I'm like, man, there are not that many people who are really expert in this, and they're booked up forever.
Yep, totally.
So when I saw that you guys were coming onto the scene, I'm like, amazing. Just, somewhere I can send people who ask.
That's what we want to be. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, is there anything that we have not addressed here in these last couple of minutes that you would like to? Anything we've written down? I've gone through all my notes, I think.
Well, just to do the couple of questions on Twitter, I wanted to give them a really earnest effort. The two that I'm not sure we talked about was what seems to be working and how accessible will it be to the general population. And the how accessible will be to the general population, I'm super optimistic. There's a couple of things that I think there's a whole lot more that we would like to do, and questions we'd like to ask, and things we'd like to evaluate to really understand what is the indicators of like fast response to Jhāna training, and maybe like what practice is right. But I think as we get better at this, we're going to be able to better serve the general population. I also think that the general population in some ways is a bit more like embodied and in tune to their emotions already than your average like Silicon Valley engineer, where we've like where we feel like have really hit it off so far. And so there's some reasons to think that some of these dynamics will come into play too. I guess, and the third thing that sort of gives me optimism is that I really do believe in some ways these states have been rediscovered over time and place. And
definitely, this is a cultural universal. I mean, a human universal, not culture. Irrespective of culture, if you have a functioning mammalian nervous system, something like this is possible for you. That's my opinion.
Yeah. We certainly hope that that's true, and think there's reason to be optimistic about that. And then with regards to what seems working, there's we mentioned at the high level that we do things like lean into loving kindness as an on-ramp into Jhāna's, really lean into sort of experimentation and curiosity, relaxation, surrender, these kinds of things. That may sound abstract at first, but I actually think that is a very concrete way of pointing at that which works. The thing that we think is so valuable in working here, I think one is this like heart opening leading into the natural state of human compassion. Number two, and very much like embodied, full nervous system, this kind of thing. But then maybe above all is just saying like, hey, look, the Jhanas are out there. Let's experiment.
These exist. Did you know?
Yeah.
Most people don't.
Right. It's like they're out there and now let's experiment. And so really the experience on retreat is we do give you some starting instructions, and these are like influenced by Lee Brasington, the Twin community, and Robert Bea.
Yep.
And then I think where the magic happens is the fact that you take an experimentation mindset and you run out there and you spend the day running experiments in your own head to see how you can like, okay, there's a relationship between curiosity and pleasure, and also relaxation, and these things go hand in hand. Oh, I see now why concentration may be a mistranslation, and that collectedness and like the ease and relaxation into stability is in some ways like a really effective route. These kinds of things, I can tell you that all day, but you really have to run the experiments to see them. And we've designed some exercises that help novices with some of the most common anti-patterns that we've seen. And then you come into your interview and we're like, okay, great. What did you try and what did you learn? And you rattle it all off, and then we say, oh, that really makes us think of, and then we sort of share the patterns that we've seen from what's now hundreds of other students, and then we co-create an experimentation plan for you to go out and play in the sandbox again. And so in some ways that may be dissatisfying to say what's working is experimentation. On the other hand,
collaboration in meditation between teacher and student. If you're working with another model, something more rigid or formulaic, I mean, my experience as a teacher and as a student, your success rate is just not going to be as high as it would be if you were more adaptive and flexible in exactly the way you're describing. So that is no surprise to me. Yeah.
So, but I think that I do think then we managed to make it through all the questions on Twitter, and appreciated people dropping their notes.
Right. Yeah, and I imagine I'm kind of a non-confrontational person just by personality. So for those with some of the more pointed questions, I hope I did a decent job at bringing that up and presenting those concerns, because they're valid and there's a reason for them. It at least needs to be brought into discussion, because this isn't the first time you're going to be hearing comments like that, and I'm sure it won't be the last.
Totally, and we'll learn from it.
Great. Well, Stephen, unless there is anything else, I think we're good to close it off there. Obviously, where can people go to check the company out?
Yeah, so I'm at Stephen_Zerfas on Twitter. Zerfas is Z as in zebra, ER, F as in Frank, A, S as in Sam. And the company's called Jhāna Tech. Jhāna is Jhana. Sorry, the handle is at Jhāna Tech. The company is called Jhourney, and there's an H in Jhourney, Jhourney. And you can find us at jhourney.org, jhourney.io. Those will route back. You'll be able to find us, Jhāna Jhourney, that kind of stuff in Google will find us. And my co-founder, Alex Gruver, is also on Twitter. So you can find him at, I think his handle is Alex_Gruver1. Let me just...
Great. And I will put all of these links in the description below on YouTube and in the show notes on Spotify, so people can just look down there to click, or if you're listening audio or video, you can type all that in.
That'd be great. Yeah. Great. Well, this was fun, Weston. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, likewise. A little rough recording with some internet issues and my cat deciding to pop in, but we'll wrap all that up in editing. And thanks so much for coming on, Stephen.
Yeah.
I'm a fan of what you guys are up to. I would like to see Jhāna's be as accessible to as many people as are interested. So thanks for doing what you're doing, and keep on keeping on.
Yeah, thank you, Weston. I enjoy your tweets, and I think a number of people have benefited from your coaching too.
Oh, they tell me so. It's a continual surprise.
That's great. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Stephen. All right. Bye-bye, everybody. Take care.